The carriage rattled up the long gravel drive of Bramblemere Hall just as the church bells in the village struck 4. Miss Linnea Thorne pressed her gloved hand against the cold window glass and stared up at the grey stone manor rising against a sky heavy with rain clouds. She had heard whispers about this place from the moment she accepted the post. 6 nurses dismissed in under 2 years. Some said the Duke of Ravenshollow threw plates. Others swore he never spoke a single word to the women hired to care for him, simply stared until they packed their trunks and fled. Linnea did not believe half of what servants gossiped about in coaching inns. She had nursed soldiers with shattered limbs who screamed through the night. A bitter duke, she told herself, could hardly be worse. She stepped down from the carriage, still wearing her plain grey traveling dress, beneath a dark wool pelisse, her only luggage, a single leather medical case that had belonged to her late father. No maid accompanied her, no letters of introduction beyond the one from the infirmary matron who had recommended her for this post with a strange, almost pitying look in her eyes. The butler, a thin, grey-whiskered man named Mr. Ashby, met her at the door with barely concealed doubt. "You are younger than the others," he said, glancing at her case as though it might contain nothing more useful than embroidery thread. "I am old enough to do the work," Linnea replied evenly, and swept past him into the entrance hall before he could argue further. The hall was dim, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon light, though it was hardly evening. A chill hung in the air despite the season. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock ticked with a hollow, funereal patience. She was led without ceremony to a set of heavy oak doors on the ground floor, where Mr. Ashby paused, his hand hovering near the handle. "His Grace does not receive visitors well," he warned quietly. "I would suggest introducing yourself briefly and allowing him to dismiss you in his own time. It is easier that way." "Dismiss me?" Linnea repeated, arching a brow. "You speak as though it is already decided." Mr. Ashby said nothing. He simply opened the door. The chamber beyond was thick with shadow, the velvet curtains drawn so completely that only a sliver of gray daylight crept along the floorboards. A fire burned low in the hearth, throwing more smoke than warmth into the stale air. And in the center of the room, seated in a wheeled invalid chair with a woolen blanket draped over his legs, was Duke Alaric Ravenshollow. He did not turn to look at her at first. His dark hair had grown longer than fashion allowed, and his jaw carried the shadow of a beard left untended for days. Once, she had been told, he had been called the finest horseman in the North Riding. Now his broad shoulders sat hunched forward, as though the weight of the chair itself had become unbearable. "Another one," he said at last, his voice low and rough, still carrying the authority of a man used to command. "Ashby, did you not tell her the terms? I do not require assistance. I require solitude. I am not here to argue with you, Your Grace," Linnea said, setting her case down upon a side table with a firm click. "I am here to see that you are properly cared for. Whether you enjoy it is not my concern." His head turned sharply then, and for the first time his eyes met hers, dark, tired, but sharp with an anger that had clearly frightened 6 women before her. "Leave my chamber." Linnea did not move. Instead, she crossed to the window and threw back the heavy curtains in one firm pull. Gray autumn light flooded the room, catching the dust hanging thick in the stale air. "What in God's name are you doing?" the Duke demanded, shielding his eyes as though the daylight itself were an assault. "Letting in air that does not smell of sickness and old smoke," Linnea replied, already moving toward the withered arrangement of flowers, rotting in a vase upon the mantel. She lifted it without asking and handed it to a startled housemaid hovering in the doorway. "These should have been removed a week ago." "I did not ask for your opinion on my flowers." "No," she agreed, "but you shall have it regardless." Before he could summon further protest, she had already signaled for 2 footmen to wheel his chair from the chamber altogether, ignoring his furious command to stop, insisting instead that he be taken to the glass conservatory at the rear of the house, where the last of the autumn light still lingered warm against the stone floor. By the time evening fell, the entire household was certain of her dismissal. Housemaids whispered in the corridors. Even Mr. Ashby had begun drafting, in his mind, the letter of release he expected to write by morning. But that night, as the Duke sat alone in the conservatory long after Linnea had retired, he found himself oddly unwilling to summon Ashby and demand her departure. There was something else too, something none of the servants understood. The 6 nurses before her had not simply grown afraid and fled. Each had been paid, quietly, generously, to leave without explanation, and warned never to speak of what they had witnessed in this house. Whatever secret those women carried away with them, Alaric was not yet certain Linnea Thorne would be so easily silenced. So when Ashby knocked upon his door that evening to ask whether the new nurse should be sent away at first light, the Duke surprised even himself. "Let her stay," he said quietly. "One more day." Morning at Bramblemere Hall arrived the way it always did, quietly, reluctantly, as though the house itself dreaded waking. Linnea rose before the servant's bell and made her way down to the breakfast room, expecting to find the Duke already seated. Instead, she found an empty chair pulled close to the hearth, a tray of cold tea and untouched bread sitting beside it, and a stillness so complete it unsettled her more than any illness she had nursed before. "He takes his meals alone, by the fire," explained Sarah, a young housemaid who had grown fond of Linnea within a single day. "Has done since the accident. Nobody speaks much at table. His Grace prefers it that way, or so we've been told." Linnea studied the cold tea, the untouched bread, the heavy curtains drawn even here in the breakfast room, where morning light should have poured freely across the table linen. "Prefers it," she repeated softly, "or has simply never been given a reason to want otherwise." She found Lady Honoria Ravenshollow in the small parlor that afternoon, a stern woman in her 50s, dressed in unrelenting black, her needlework resting untouched upon her lap, while she watched the fire with the fixed attention of someone counting the days until winter finally settled in for good. "You are the new one," Lady Honoria said without looking up, "the one who threw open his curtains." "I am, my lady. 6 women came before you. Each left within a fortnight, some sooner." Lady Honoria's needle finally moved, slow and deliberate. "I do not say this to frighten you. I say it so you understand what you have inherited. This house has already made its peace with what my nephew has become. I would advise you do the same, for your own sake." Linnea said nothing to this, though something in her chest tightened with quiet defiance. She had not traveled from the infirmary at Thornhaven to make peace with despair. The following morning, she instructed that breakfast be laid instead in the south-facing sitting room, where tall windows caught the earliest sun before it climbed too high and lost its warmth. When the Duke was wheeled in and saw the table already set, he scowled deeply. "I did not request this room." "No," Linnea agreed, pouring his tea herself rather than waiting for a servant. "But the fire in your usual chamber does nothing but choke the air, and a man cannot heal properly breathing smoke from dawn until dusk. You presume a great deal for a woman paid to change dressings and measure medicine." "I presume only what any sensible person would," she replied, unbothered. "That sunlight does more good than shadow, and silence breeds despair faster than any fever." He did not answer her directly, though she noticed, when she returned an hour later to collect the tray, that he had eaten more bread than he had in the past week combined, according to what Sarah quietly reported. Encouraged by this small victory, Linnea pressed further in the days that followed. She insisted the formal gardens be opened for his chair whenever weather allowed, despite Ashby's protests that his grace had not set foot, or wheel, beyond the terrace in nearly 2 years. She had heavy, unnecessary furniture removed from his private chambers, pieces that did nothing but crowd the narrow space where his chair required room to turn freely. She replaced the thick, suffocating drapery throughout his rooms with lighter fabric that still offered privacy without smothering what daylight remained each afternoon. Each change was met with resistance. Each resistance was met with Linnea's calm, immovable insistence that she knew precisely what she was doing, whether or not he believed her. "You enjoy contradicting me," the Duke remarked one gray afternoon, as she wheeled him along the gravel path bordering the rose beds, now bare and thorny with the coming season. "I enjoy seeing you argue," Linnea admitted, surprising even herself with her honesty. "It is the first sign of life I have seen in this house since I arrived." He turned his head sharply at that, and for a moment, something almost resembling amusement flickered across his tired features before he masked it with his usual scowl. "You are impertinent. I have been called worse, Your Grace." Yet despite his complaints to Ashby, despite the sharp words he directed at her nearly every morning, Alaric found himself, quietly and against his own wishes, beginning to anticipate their daily disagreements. There was something in the way she refused to lower her eyes, refused to treat him as though he were already a dead man occupying a living man's chair, that stirred something in him he had believed long buried beneath 2 years of grief. Lady Honoria, however, watched these changes with growing unease rather than hope. To her, the disruption of routine was not healing. It was disorder, an unraveling of the careful dignity she had spent 2 years constructing around her nephew's ruin. She began speaking quietly with Ashby in the evenings, asking pointed questions about the new nurse's conduct, her background, her true intentions in accepting a post that 6 other capable women had fled. "She oversteps," Lady Honoria said one evening, watching from the parlor window as Linnea walked briskly across the darkening lawn toward the stables, a lantern swinging in her hand. "And I intend to discover precisely why she is so determined to do so." The lantern Linnea carried that evening was not, as Lady Honoria assumed, evidence of some secretive errand. She had simply asked Sarah where the old stables stood, having noticed the Duke's gaze drift toward the far end of the estate each time his chair was wheeled past the gardens, lingering a moment too long on the weathered roof visible beyond the hedgerow before he looked sharply away. She mentioned it to him directly the following morning. Over tea, he no longer complained about drinking in the south-facing room. "The stables," she said, watching his face carefully. "Nobody has mentioned them once since I arrived. Sarah tells me they stand empty. There is nothing there worth seeing." His voice had gone flat, guarded in a way she had not heard before, not even during their sharpest arguments. "Then there is no harm in seeing it." He refused for 3 days. On the 4th, without quite agreeing to anything, he allowed the footmen to wheel him along the gravel path toward the old stable yard, Linnea walking silently beside him rather than pressing conversation, sensing that whatever waited there required no further persuasion from her. The stables had fallen into a sorrowful state of neglect. Ivy had crept up the stone walls, and the great wooden doors, once surely painted a proud Ravenshollow blue, had faded and warped with years of rain. An elderly stable hand named Thomas, kept on despite having nothing left to tend, emerged from a side building at the sound of wheels upon gravel, his weathered face brightening with startled disbelief. "Your Grace," he said, bowing low, "I never thought to see you here again." Alaric said nothing for a long moment, staring at the empty stalls beyond the doors, the dust thick upon untouched saddles, still hanging from their pegs, as though awaiting a rider who might never return. "I kept them oiled," Thomas offered quietly, misreading the silence. "The saddle's in case—" He stopped himself, uncertain how to finish. "There is no need," Alaric said, his voice rough. "There will be no riding." Linnea watched the old stable hand's face fall, watched something close behind the Duke's eyes, and she understood, in that moment, precisely what this place represented. Not merely horses lost to circumstance, but the final proof of everything the accident had taken from him. Later, while Alaric sat alone in the yard longer than she expected, Linnea drew Thomas aside near the tack room, asking gently what he remembered of the weeks following the accident. "He tried at first," Thomas admitted, lowering his voice. "The physicians came from London, had him attempt to stand, attempt small exercises, but each time he failed, and he failed often, my lady, for his legs would simply give beneath him. He grew more silent than the time before. After the fourth or fifth attempt, he refused it all, said he would rather accept what he was than be humiliated chasing what he was not." Linnea considered this carefully as she walked back toward the house that afternoon. She had assumed, as most had, that the Duke's paralysis alone kept him confined to his chair. Now she understood the truer obstacle was not injury, but fear. Fear of trying and failing again before witnesses who would only confirm what he already believed of himself. That evening, rather than returning directly to Bramblemere Hall, she asked the coachman to take her instead to the market town of Eldercombe, some 3 miles distant, where she had heard mention of a bone-setter well regarded among the tenant farmers for his practical knowledge of injured limbs, knowledge often dismissed by fashionable London physicians who preferred theory to experience. She found him in a modest cottage near the church, an elderly man named Mr. Gideon Hale, his hands scarred and calloused, from decades of setting broken bones for farmers and laborers who could not afford grander treatment. 2 years since the injury, you say, he mused, listening carefully as Linnea described what little she knew of the Duke's condition. "And no continued exercise since the early attempts failed?" "None." Mr. Hale shook his head slowly. "Muscles left idle that long grow weaker still, my lady. Whatever strength once remained beneath the injury. But weakness is not always the same as ruin. I have seen limbs thought entirely lost regain some feeling, given patience and steady effort, provided the injury itself did not sever what carries feeling from the mind to the muscle entirely. Has any physician determined that with certainty?" Linnea hesitated, realizing she did not know the answer, nor was she certain the London physicians had ever properly tested for it, rather than simply declaring the case hopeless after a handful of failed attempts. She returned to Bramblemere Hall well after dark, her mind turning over everything Mr. Hale had told her, a fragile new determination taking root where before she had carried only instinct and stubbornness. She did not yet know whether the Duke could truly recover what the accident had stolen from him, but she was no longer certain, as every physician before her had apparently been, that recovery was entirely beyond reach. What she needed now was proof, careful, patient, undeniable proof, and the courage to defend it against everyone in that house who had already decided, long before her arrival, that hope itself was a cruelty best avoided. Dr. Percival Moorcroft arrived at Bramblemere Hall on the first Tuesday of the month, precisely as he had done for the past 2 years, his carriage announced by the crunch of gravel and the particular briskness of a man who considered himself indispensable. He was tall and silver-haired, with the sort of confident bearing that came from decades of practice among titled families, who rarely questioned his judgment. Linnea had heard much about him already from Sarah and the other servants, how he had first pronounced the Duke's condition beyond remedy within a fortnight of the accident, how his word had become the household's gospel ever since, repeated by Lady Honoria as though it were scripture no one dared challenge. She had not expected to clash with him quite so soon. He found her in the drawing room that afternoon, kneeling beside the Duke's chair, guiding him through a series of careful movements Mr. Hale had described to her. Gentle pressure against the muscles of the thigh, a slow attempt at bearing weight through a supported stand, using a low table for balance. Alaric's face was set with grim concentration, sweat beading at his temple from the effort. When Dr. Moorcroft's voice cut sharply across the room, "What in heaven's name is this display?" Linnea rose slowly, unwilling to be startled into apology. "Exercise, doctor, nothing more. Exercise." He said the word as though it tasted foul in his mouth. "I examined his grace myself within days of his injury. I consulted 3 colleagues from London, each in agreement that the damage to his spine left no possibility of restored movement. You would have him believe otherwise. Based on what authority precisely? Based on the observation that muscles left entirely idle for 2 years grow weaker regardless of the original injury," Linnea replied evenly, "and that nothing has been attempted since those first weeks to determine whether feeling might yet be encouraged to return." Dr. Moorcroft's face reddened with an anger he did not trouble to disguise before the assembled household. Lady Honoria near the window, Ashby by the door, 2 housemaids pretending occupation with the tea service while listening intently. "You offer false hope to a man who has suffered enough disappointment. It is not merely foolish, Miss Thorne, it is cruel." "Cruelty," Linnea said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her own chest, "would be allowing him to waste away in a darkened room, believing nothing further could ever be attempted, simply because trying once proved difficult. You overstep considerably for a provincial nurse, and you have grown comfortable repeating a conclusion you reached 2 years ago without troubling yourself to reconsider it since." A heavy silence fell across the room. Even Alaric, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, looked between them with something unreadable in his expression. Embarrassment, certainly, at being discussed as though he were not present, but perhaps something else beneath it, some flicker of interest in watching his physician's certainty challenged so openly for the first time in 2 years. Dr. Moorcroft recovered his composure first, turning to Lady Honoria with the wounded dignity of a man unused to contradiction. "I would recommend her dismissal, my lady, before her methods cause genuine harm." Rather than argue further, Linnea crossed to the small writing desk near the window and retrieved a leather-bound notebook she had kept faithfully since her arrival. She opened it before Lady Honoria and Dr. Moorcroft both, revealing pages of careful observations recorded in her neat hand. Dates, small movements noted in the muscles of the Duke's legs, faint responses to touch that had not been present during her first week. Slight improvements in circulation she had measured by the warmth, returning gradually to his feet. "I do not ask anyone to take my word alone," she said quietly. "I ask only that the evidence be considered before hope is dismissed entirely as foolishness." Dr. Moorcroft glanced at the notebook with visible disdain, dismissing it after the briefest examination. "Anecdote, Miss Thorne, recorded by an untrained hand, proves nothing whatsoever." Yet Lady Honoria, who had said nothing throughout the confrontation, took the notebook from Linnea's hands and studied it a moment longer than Dr. Moorcroft had troubled to. Her expression remained guarded, betraying nothing of what she truly thought, though something in her stillness suggested the physician's easy dismissal had not entirely satisfied her either. After Dr. Moorcroft departed that evening, his carriage rattling back down the drive with considerably less confidence than it had arrived, Alaric summoned Linnea to his chamber. She expected further reprimand, perhaps even her dismissal at last, given how thoroughly she had embarrassed him before his own physician and household. Instead, he sat silent for a long moment, staring at the fire. "You will not defend me in that manner again," he said finally, his voice low. "Whatever your reasons, I will not be spoken of as though I were a horse, being appraised at market. I understand, your grace. See that you do." She curtsied and withdrew, believing the matter settled, her notebook left behind on the side table, where she had set it during the argument. It was only the following morning, when she returned to collect it, that she noticed the ribbon marking her most recent entries had been moved, shifted only slightly, but enough to reveal that someone had read every page long after the house had gone dark and silent around him. Autumn had begun its final surrender to winter when Linnea first suggested the coastal lodge. She raised it carefully over breakfast, choosing her words with more caution than usual, aware that any request touching upon the outside world was still liable to meet resistance. "A change of surroundings might do more for you than another week within these walls," she said. "Sarah mentions a lodge at Whitstone, overlooking the cliffs. Empty since the accident, I am told." Alaric's jaw tightened. "I have no wish to be stared at by strangers along some public shore. The lodge stands apart from the village, does it not? Overlooking the cliffs rather than the promenade." She had already made quiet inquiries. "There would be no strangers, your grace, only sea air, and rather better company than the shadows of this drawing-room." He did not agree that morning, nor the next, but Linnea had learned by now that his refusals rarely meant what they claimed. She raised the matter instead with Lady Honoria, who surprised her by offering little resistance. "He has not left this house in 2 years," Lady Honoria said quietly, folding her needlework with unusual care. "Perhaps it is time he remembered the world exists beyond it. See that proper arrangements are made." They departed within the week, the carriage rattling northward along roads growing steadily wilder, as the cultivated fields of the estate gave way to open moorland, and eventually the first gray glimpse of the sea itself, vast and restless beneath a sky heavy with gulls. The lodge at Whitstone stood alone upon a rise overlooking the cliffs, a modest stone house, far removed from the grandeur of Bramblemere Hall, its rooms smaller, its fires warmer, its windows filled entirely with sky and water rather than manicured gardens. Alaric said little during the first day, watching the waves from behind glass with an expression Linnea could not quite read. It was on the second evening, as she wheeled his chair along the cliff path while the sun sank low and orange over the water, that he finally spoke of something he had never mentioned within the walls of his own home. "My brother was meant to inherit," he said abruptly, staring out at the darkening water. "Edmund, 3 years my senior and far better suited to the title than I ever was. He died of a fever when I was 19, and the whole weight of it fell to me instead, a horseman who preferred the stables to the study, thrust into responsibilities I had never wanted." Linnea said nothing, sensing he required silence more than response. "When the carriage overturned," he continued, his voice roughening, "I remember thinking, in the moment before I lost consciousness, that perhaps this was simply what I deserved, to lose the one thing I had ever loved without complication, as punishment for resenting the life I had been given instead of the one I wanted." He shook his head slowly. "I have never spoken that thought aloud to anyone." "It was not punishment," Linnea said quietly. "It was an accident, nothing more. You cannot know that with certainty." "No," she admitted. "But I know that carrying guilt for surviving something you did not cause has never once mended a broken limb. And I doubt very much it has mended anything within you these 2 years either." He turned to look at her then, something shifting behind his tired eyes, and for a long moment neither spoke, as the wind carried the cry of gulls across the darkening cliffs. The days that followed settled into a rhythm unlike any they had known at Bramblemere Hall. Each morning, Linnea guided him through exercises upon the flat stretch of lawn behind the lodge, the sea air sharp and bracing against skin, unaccustomed to anything beyond shuttered rooms. Each afternoon they walked, or rather, he was wheeled, and she walked beside him, along the cliff paths, the demanding terrain, requiring greater effort from muscles Mr. Hale had promised, might yet remember their old purpose. It was on the 5th morning, as she pressed firm hands against his calf during their usual exercises, that Alaric went suddenly still. "What is it?" Linnea asked, alarmed by his expression. "I felt that," he said slowly, disbelief thick in his voice. "Not fully, not as I once would have, but something, warmth, pressure, where before there was nothing at all." Linnea's breath caught. She pressed again, more gently this time, watching his face carefully. "And now?" "Yes," he whispered, faintly, but yes. Neither spoke for a long moment, the only sound the distant crash of waves against rock far below the cliffs. Linnea felt tears threaten unexpectedly, and she blinked them back, unwilling to let sentiment overtake the careful discipline she had maintained for weeks. "This does not mean you shall walk again tomorrow," she said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her effort at composure. "It means only that something remains worth working toward. It is more than I have felt in 2 years," Alaric said quietly, staring down at his own leg, as though seeing it for the first time. "I had believed it entirely lost to me." That evening, as they sat together before the fire while the sea wind rattled softly against the windows, Alaric spoke less of guilt and more, for the first time, of a future he had long ago stopped permitting himself to imagine, not of walking unaided across some grand ballroom, but simply of the possibility that his life might yet hold more than the 4 walls he had confined himself within since the accident. Linnea listened, saying little, though something within her own chest had begun to shift as well, quiet and unacknowledged, in ways she was not yet prepared to examine too closely. They returned to Bramblemere Hall in early December, the estate wearing its first dusting of frost across the lawns, and Alaric returned a different man than the one who had left it. He said little of the change directly, but Lady Honoria noticed it within the first hour, the way he asked, unprompted, whether any correspondence had arrived during his absence, a question he had not troubled himself with in nearly 2 years. "There is a great deal," Ashby admitted carefully, "though much of it has been handled by Mr. Grimshaw, the estate steward, in your Grace's stead." "Bring it to my study regardless," Alaric said. "I should like to see it for myself." Linnea, present in the room only to arrange his afternoon medicines, said nothing, though she felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest at the request. She had not suggested it directly, believing some steps required no urging from her at all, only opportunity. It was 3 days later, while helping to sort through years of neglected correspondence stacked haphazardly upon the study shelves, that Linnea first noticed the discrepancies. She had not meant to pry into estate matters. Her task had been simply to organize papers scattered by dust and disorder. But the numbers within one particular ledger caught her attention regardless, figures for tenant rents that did not match the smaller sums recorded as received in a second, more recently kept book. She said nothing at first, uncertain whether the matter fell within her place to raise. But when Alaric himself, reviewing the same ledgers a week later, with growing confusion, summoned her to confirm what she had already suspected, she could no longer stay silent. "These figures do not agree," he said, frowning over the pages spread across his desk. "Grimshaw's reports claim rents have fallen steadily these 2 years, yet the tenant receipts suggest otherwise entirely." "I noticed the same discrepancy myself," Linnea admitted. "I did not think it my place to mention it uninvited." "You ought to have mentioned it regardless." His voice held no true anger, only weary frustration at circumstances he had allowed to slip entirely from his grasp. "Send for Grimshaw. I would have an explanation." Mr. Grimshaw arrived the following morning with the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to going unquestioned, offering vague explanations about difficult harvests and tenant hardship that grew increasingly unconvincing under Alaric's persistent questioning. By the time the steward departed, red-faced and stammering, it had become clear that he and at least two other estate officials had quietly siphoned funds meant for tenant improvements and estate maintenance during the years of the Duke's withdrawal from active management, trusting that a man confined to his chair, buried in grief, would never trouble himself to look closely enough to notice. 2 years, Alaric said grimly, staring at the false figures spread across his desk. 2 years, they have robbed this estate blind, and I allowed it simply by refusing to look. You could not have known, Linnea said gently, while believing yourself entirely finished with the world beyond your own chamber. That is precisely the trouble, he replied. I made myself finished with it. Nothing forced that decision upon me but my own despair. Rather than allowing guilt to settle over him as it once might have, he threw himself into correcting the matter with an energy Linnea had not yet witnessed in him, reviewing tenant complaints personally, riding out in his chair to inspect farms he had not visited since before the accident, dismissing Grimshaw and 2 other dishonest officials within the fortnight, and appointing in their place men recommended by the very tenants who had suffered under the previous arrangement. The work exhausted him considerably, more than Linnea had anticipated, yet she noticed something else alongside the fatigue, a steadiness returning to his bearing, a sharpness to his mind that had clearly atrophied alongside his legs during 2 years of confinement and grief. The discipline required to manage tenant disputes and review complicated accounts seemed, curiously, to strengthen his resolve during their now daily exercises as well, as though the mental effort of one task fed directly into the physical demands of the other. I had forgotten what it felt like, he admitted one evening, reviewing tenant petitions by candlelight, while Linnea prepared his evening medicines nearby, to be needed for something beyond simply enduring my own condition. You were always needed, Linnea said quietly. You had simply convinced yourself otherwise. Lady Honoria observed these changes with an expression that shifted, week by week, from wary suspicion toward something closer to grudging admiration. She had expected disorder from Linnea's unconventional methods, disruption to the careful stability she had maintained around her nephew's ruin. Instead, she found herself witnessing something she had not believed possible. Not merely a body slowly regaining strength, but a man reclaiming purpose she had assumed lost to him forever, alongside the use of his legs. You have done something none of us managed in 2 years, Lady Honoria said to Linnea one evening, finding her alone in the small parlor, mending a torn hem by firelight. I do not know whether to thank you or resent you for it, Miss Thorne. Perhaps, in time, I shall manage both. Linnea smiled faintly at that, setting aside her mending. I should be glad of either, my lady, provided his grace continues forward rather than back. Outside, the first true snow of winter had begun to fall silently across the estate, blanketing the gardens and the once neglected stables alike, while within the study, long past the hour most households had retired for the night, the Duke of Ravenshollow remained bent over tenant ledgers by candlelight, working toward a future he had, until recently, believed entirely beyond his reach. The annual Ravenshollow Winter Assembly had not been held since before the accident, cancelled first, out of necessity, and then, over successive years, out of habit so entrenched that nobody within the household had thought to question it. So it came as considerable surprise to everyone, Linnea included, when Alaric announced at breakfast in mid-December that the ball would proceed that year as it had always done in his father's time. Your Grace, are you quite certain? Ashby asked, unable to fully disguise his astonishment. It has been some years since Bramblemere Hall hosted such a gathering. Precisely why it should be held now, Alaric replied, folding his newspaper with new decisiveness. I have hidden from society long enough. Let them come and see for themselves whatever they expect to find. Lady Honoria, initially startled by the suggestion, threw herself into preparations with an enthusiasm Linnea had not previously witnessed in her. As though the ball represented a return to normalcy she had quietly mourned losing. Invitations were dispatched throughout the county. The ballroom, shuttered and dust-sheeted for 2 years, was aired and polished until the old parquet floor gleamed once more beneath restored chandeliers. Linnea, meanwhile, turned her attention to a private matter she had been quietly cultivating for weeks. Working with the estate carpenter under strict secrecy, she had commissioned a set of sturdy parallel rails, carved from oak and fitted with padded supports, designed specifically to allow Alaric practice at bearing his own weight while holding firmly to something solid on either side. "You believe I might stand unaided by the night of the ball?" Alaric asked, half disbelieving when she first revealed the rails hidden away in an unused chamber adjoining his study. "I believe you might stand," Linnea said carefully, "supported, and only briefly, and only before witnesses we can trust absolutely. I promise nothing beyond that." They practiced in secret each evening after the household retired, Alaric gripping the rails with white-knuckled determination, while Linnea guided his legs through the careful weight-bearing exercises Mr. Hale had first described to her, his progress agonizingly slow, marked by failures far more numerous than successes, his frustration boiling over more than once into sharp words. He inevitably apologized for the following morning. "I cannot manage it," he said one night, breathing hard after his knees had buckled for the 4th time in an hour, sweat soaking through his shirt, despite the winter chill. Perhaps Moorcroft was right after all. "Moorcroft has never once attempted what you attempt each evening," Linnea replied, unmoved by his despair. Stand again. He stood again, and again, until finally, close to midnight, he held himself upright between the rails for nearly 3 full seconds before his strength gave way entirely, and Linnea caught him before he fell. 3 seconds, he said afterward, breathless, with something between exhaustion and disbelief. 3 seconds you did not have a month ago, Linnea reminded him. By the night of the ball itself, held on the shortest evening of the year, with snow falling steadily beyond the tall windows, Bramblemere Hall glittered with candlelight and music for the first time in 2 years. Society guests arrived in their finest silks and velvets, many clearly anticipating the spectacle of a broken duke hidden away in some private chamber, unwilling to be witnessed in his diminished state. Instead, they found Alaric presiding over his own ballroom from his wheeled chair with a wit and authority that startled even those who remembered him best from before the accident, engaging guests in conversation, overseeing the evening's arrangements with careful attention, refusing entirely to be treated as an object of pity rather than the host of his own celebration. Dr. Moorcroft, present among the guests at Lady Honoria's insistence, watched this transformation with visible unease. Clearly troubled by a vigor in the Duke he had confidently declared impossible barely 2 months prior. It was well past 11 when most guests had retired to the card room and refreshment tables, that Linnea caught Alaric's eye across the crowded ballroom and gave the smallest, deliberate nod toward the adjoining chamber where the oak rails waited, concealed behind a folding screen for precisely this purpose. Only a handful of trusted witnesses followed. Lady Honoria, Sarah, and, at Alaric's own quiet insistence, Dr. Moorcroft himself, summoned specifically to see what he had declared beyond possibility. With Linnea steadying him at first, and then stepping back entirely, Alaric gripped the padded rails and, slowly, deliberately, pushed himself upright from his chair. He stood for nearly 6 full seconds, considerably longer than he had ever managed during their private practice. He remained upright, entirely unaided, his legs trembling with the effort, but holding firm beneath him, before he carefully lowered himself back into the chair, breathing hard, his face flushed with an emotion far beyond mere physical exertion. Lady Honoria pressed a hand to her mouth, tears standing openly in her eyes. Sarah wept without any attempt at composure whatsoever, and Dr. Moorcroft stood utterly still, his earlier certainty visibly crumbling before something he could no longer explain away with theory or professional authority. "I do not understand it," he admitted quietly, more to himself than anyone else present. "By every principle I was taught, this should not be possible." "Perhaps," Linnea said gently, though not unkindly, "some principles require reconsidering rather than defending." Alaric said nothing at all, simply reaching for Linnea's hand and holding it a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, while beyond the folding screen, the music and laughter of the winter assembly continued on, entirely unaware of the small miracle that had just unfolded in the quiet room beside them. The letter arrived on a gray January morning, carried up from the village post with the ordinary correspondence. Ashby sorted each day, though nothing about its contents proved ordinary, once Linnea broke the seal and read its contents by the window of her small chamber. It came from the matron of St. Bartholomew's Charitable Infirmary in London, a woman Linnea had trained under briefly some years before, offering her the position of senior nurse overseeing the women's ward. A post of considerable standing, one that would secure her reputation and her future far beyond anything a private nursing position could offer, however well it paid. She read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully away, saying nothing of it to anyone, for several days. By early February, with Alaric now able to bear his own weight for several minutes at a stretch, using only a walking stick for balance, rather than the full support of the parallel rails, Linnea found herself increasingly uncertain of her continued purpose at Bramblemere Hall. She had done what she came to do. The despair that once hung over the house had lifted considerably. The estate ran honestly, once more under Alaric's own careful management. He no longer required the constant supervision her position had originally been engaged to provide. "I have received an offer," she finally told Lady Honoria one evening, unable to carry the secret any longer without confiding in someone. "From London, a post at St. Bartholomew's." Lady Honoria set down her needlework slowly. "And you intend to accept it?" "I believe I must," Linnea said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "His Grace requires me far less than he once did. There are other patients, other households, that might benefit from what skill I possess, while I remain merely underfoot here, watching him manage quite capably, without my constant assistance." "You believe that is truly why you hesitate," Lady Honoria said, not unkindly. "Or do you simply find it easier to believe than the alternative?" Linnea said nothing to this, unwilling to examine too closely what Lady Honoria's words implied. She began quietly training Sarah in the basic exercises and daily routines Alaric now required, intending to depart within a fortnight once she felt confident the transition would leave him properly supported. She said nothing to Alaric himself of the London offer until she could no longer avoid it, finally raising the matter one evening as she helped him through his exercises in the study, the walking stick leaning against his desk within easy reach. "I have accepted a position in London," she said, keeping her eyes fixed upon his leg rather than his face as she spoke. "At St. Bartholomew's, I shall train Sarah thoroughly before I go, and Mr. Hale has agreed to visit monthly to oversee your continued progress." Alaric went very still. "When do you leave?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled in a manner that told her far more than the words themselves. within the fortnight. He said nothing further that evening, and Linnea told herself his silence meant nothing beyond simple surprise, though something in her own chest ached considerably more than she cared to admit, even to herself, as she left him alone in the study that night. It was 2 days before their farewell that Alaric finally spoke plainly, finding her alone in the conservatory, where she had first wheeled him against his furious protests all those months before, the glass panes now frosted with winter cold rather than warmed by autumn sun. "I have been attempting to determine," he said, leaning heavily upon his walking stick as he crossed the conservatory floor toward her, each step still requiring visible effort, though no longer requiring assistance. "Precisely what I ought to say to you before you leave this house. There is no need for elaborate farewells, Your Grace," Linnea said, though her voice caught slightly, despite her effort at composure. "I have simply done the work I was engaged to perform." "You have done considerably more than that," he said, "and we both know it." He paused, gathering himself with visible effort. "Do you recall the first afternoon you arrived here? I ordered you from my chamber within minutes of meeting you. I recall it clearly. You disobeyed me entirely. Through open curtains I had kept closed for 2 years, removed flowers I had not troubled myself to notice were rotting, had my chair wheeled to a conservatory I had not entered since before my brother died." He shook his head slowly, something almost like wonder in his expression. "Every physician who came before you offered sympathy, or theory, or quiet resignation, dressed as professional wisdom. You alone offered defiance. You alone refused to accept what I had already convinced myself was final. I merely refused to believe despair was the only remaining option," Linnea said quietly. "You did far more than that," he said. "You challenged my pride when every other soul in this house had learned only to pity me. I did not always thank you for it at the time. I am grateful for it now, more than I have properly expressed." Linnea felt tears threaten dangerously close to the surface, and she blinked them back with considerable effort, uncertain what precisely he intended by such words, uncertain what she herself hoped he might intend. "I am glad to have been of service, Your Grace," she managed finally, though the formality of the words felt suddenly, painfully inadequate to everything unspoken between them. "Service," he repeated softly, something unreadable flickering across his tired features. "Yes, of course." Neither spoke further that evening, though something had shifted quietly between them in that frosted conservatory, unacknowledged and unresolved, as Linnea prepared to leave the house she had transformed, as thoroughly as she had transformed the man within it. London had welcomed Linnea with the brisk indifference of a city too vast to notice one more nurse among its many charitable wards. St. Bartholomew's kept her occupied from dawn until well past dark, tending to patients whose suffering was no less real for being unfamiliar to her, and yet she found herself, in quiet, unguarded moments, thinking of frosted conservatories and oak parallel rails far more often than she cared to admit even to herself. She had been in London nearly 2 months when Lady Honoria's letter arrived, its handwriting more familiar to her now than she once would have expected. "My dear Miss Thorne," it began, without the stiff formality Linnea recalled from their earliest acquaintance. "I write to invite you back to Bramblemere Hall, should your position permit a brief absence. There is something my nephew wishes you to witness, and I confess I should like you to see it as much as he wishes it himself." The letter said nothing further of what precisely awaited her, and Linnea puzzled over its meaning throughout the long carriage journey north, watching London's crowded streets give way gradually to the familiar wildness of the Yorkshire moors, the estate's stone gates rising at last against a sky washed pale with early spring sunlight. Sarah met her at the door, practically bursting with barely contained excitement she refused to explain. "You must come to the Rose Terrace, miss. Straight away. His Grace insisted you be brought there the moment you arrived, before anything else at all." Linnea followed, her heart beating faster than the short walk warranted, until she rounded the corner of the house and stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the rose beds, now budding faintly green with the season's first growth. Alaric stood waiting for her, not seated in his wheeled chair, not gripping the parallel rails for support, but standing entirely upright upon the stone terrace, a polished walnut walking stick held loosely in one hand rather than gripped for necessity. "Your Grace," Linnea breathed, one hand rising unconsciously to her mouth. "Watch," he said simply. And then, slowly, deliberately, with the walking stick tapping softly against the stone with each careful movement, Alaric walked. Not the trembling, effortful steps she remembered from their private practice sessions months before, but genuine, measured steps, one following another across the full length of the terrace, entirely without anyone's hand to steady him should he falter. He did not falter. Behind him, gathered near the terrace doors, stood Lady Honoria, with tears openly streaming down her face, Sarah clutching the arm of another housemaid in shared astonishment, and Dr. Moorcroft himself, standing perfectly still, his expression that of a man watching every certainty he had built his profession upon crumble quietly away before his own eyes. "I was wrong," Dr. Moorcroft said finally, his voice rough, with an admission that clearly cost him considerable pride. "Wrong to declare hope impossible so quickly. Wrong to dismiss what patience and proper effort might yet accomplish. I have practiced medicine 30 years, believing certainty was itself a kindness, to offer suffering patience. I begin to understand now that certainty, offered too soon, can be its own particular cruelty." Linnea said nothing, watching Alaric complete his measured walk across the terrace, and turned to face her fully, his breathing steady, despite the effort, his eyes fixed upon hers with an intensity that made the assembled witnesses around them fade entirely from her notice. "I am not fully recovered," he said quietly, once he had crossed the remaining distance between them. "Mr. Hale tells me the improvement may continue yet, or it may not advance much further beyond what I have already achieved. I cannot promise you I shall ever ride a horse again as I once did, nor dance at some future ball without considerable care." "I never asked such promises of you," Linnea said softly. "No," he agreed. "You never once asked anything of me beyond honesty and effort, and the courage to attempt what I had convinced myself was impossible." He paused, gathering himself with visible resolve. "I have thought of little else these past 2 months, beyond what I ought to say to you, should you return to witness this. I find myself entirely unpracticed at such conversations, having spent 2 years believing myself entirely unworthy of having them at all. Your Grace—" "Alaric," he corrected gently. "Please, not tonight." Linnea felt her breath catch. "Alaric," she said quietly, testing the name aloud for the first time. "I am asking you to remain at Bramblemere Hall," he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability plain upon his face. "Not as my nurse, for I begin to believe I require considerably less nursing than I once did, and not as any servant of this household whatsoever. I am asking you to remain as the woman who refused to accept my despair when every other soul had already made peace with it. The woman who restored, quite against my own wishes at the time, both my strength and whatever remained of my will to live at all." The Rose Terrace had fallen entirely silent, even Lady Honoria and Sarah holding their breath, the only sound the faint rustle of new spring leaves stirring gently upon the trees bordering the garden. "I did not come north today expecting this," Linnea admitted, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best effort at composure. "Nor did I expect it myself," Alaric replied. The first afternoon you threw open my curtains against my explicit orders. I have learned since then to expect very little of what you do, save that it invariably proves better than whatever I had planned instead." Linnea laughed then, a sound of genuine joy she had not permitted herself in weeks, and reached for his hand, finding it steady and warm within her own. "Then I shall remain," she said simply, "and we shall discover together whatever comes next." Behind them, the assembled household began, quietly and then not so quietly, to applaud, while somewhere beyond the terrace, the first true blossoms of spring continued unfurling slowly across the once neglected rosebeds, promising, as Linnea had always believed possible, that even the most stubborn winter eventually gave way to something worth waiting for.